If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. I've been wanting to talk with you a little while about stress. And on this episode, what we're going to do is we're going to think about stress. We're going to define it, and I'm going to give you a resource. And then we're going to talk about a couple of ideas that are, if left alone, simply going to increase our stress. And you'll understand a little bit more about that. But there's ways to deal with these couple of items. And then that's going to package all in as we think about stress and why stress may be going up in our culture and what we can do about it to some greater or lesser degree. I'm going to acknowledge something that I'm not a big fan of. Apparently, April is Stress Awareness Month. So if you weren't aware of stress, stress is a thing. You're now aware. Now, I think most of us are aware of stress. And I don't want to be a curmudgeon here, but oh my word. Yes, I'm already aware of all the different months that have some awareness attached to them. I don't think we need to be a whole lot more aware at that level. But anyway, I'm sort of joking a little bit. But we're all aware that stress is a thing. And I believe that we look around and we see that other people have stress too. And so we don't think it's such a big deal. And we maybe think there's nothing we can do about it. So maybe it's just not that bad. Maybe I'm just being some sort of a lightweight. Maybe I just need to, you know, strengthen up and just, let it slide off of me like water off a duck's back. And I'm not sure that it's possible for us to do that. And we'll talk about why as we define what stress is. Across the podcast episodes generally, and across the notion of Do Busy Right, I'm trying to help us deal with stress. I think as a work performance coach, I think that we're better at what we do when we don't have a whole lot of stress around. So my promise to you, and this is the purpose of the podcast, if you practice good attention management, then that's going to lead to a new level of productivity for you. And one of the purposes of that level of productivity is that level of productivity will interact with your level of stress around two things. The first thing it'll interact with is your level of stress around your to-do list. Are you getting enough done? How's your performance? And taking care of your attention management will move your productivity needle to the point where you're much more comfortable around your to-do list and getting things done. And two, that productivity will interact with your level of stress around the information that you need to manage in the world. And together, both of these things will allow your stress to go down. I think these things are two big points of stress in our modern culture. One is the to-do list and the expectations that the world has on us. And two is the amount of information that we're expected to be able to consume and manage. And I think both those things cause us stress. Now, in the episode, I'm going to try and do a couple of different things. So one is we'll talk about stress and what it is, and I'll give you a great resource around it. Two is we're going to talk about what is now a really strange notion in the modern world. It's a little countercultural, and this notion is contentment. It's not a word we hear a lot, and it's certainly not a word I think you might expect to hear on a productivity podcast. But contentment. we're going to talk about contentment, where you might get it, what it is. I think there's a discussion of stress versus contentment. And I think as we define stress, we'll see some of the value of contentment and that leads to achieving some sense of peace and calmness and clarity. And dare I say it, some sense of happiness in our life. All this is based on our attention and the fact that at this point in history, we're at a nexus of different trends of events that are colliding. Perfect storm is a little bit of a hackneyed term now, but it's pretty close. So events are moving along in such a way that the world is putting us, and more precisely our attention, under intense pressure. The intensity of the pressure is something that we have not dealt with before as a culture or as a society. Therefore, we don't have mechanisms, tools, rules to take care of. So what's happening is our attention is under this increasing amount of pressure. Our attention is spread increasingly thin. And our culture and society have not dealt with that before. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on. And those very forces, society and culture, are placing huge demands on us relative to our attention and demanding our attention from us. And it's not a published demand. It's nobody is knocking on your door and telling you that this would be happening. None of us chose it. And we'll talk about what that set of forces is and kind of lay some background for this so that you understand that it's a real thing. And hopefully that I can convince you that there's ways and means to deal with it, and then you will take those steps to put yourself in a good position to deal with it. So this episode's all about stress and what stress is, and then about a little bit about contentment, and then the events that put us here where we are. So let's get going. First of all, we'll define stress and what stress is. I've read a little bit on the subject, and my core resource is a book called The Myth of Stress, and it's by Andrew Bernstein. And I think it's a great resource for understanding stress and trying to deal with it. Again, I'm not a mental health professional. I say this over and over, but I do think that stress is something that we can deal with. And I think that there are tools around it and that we're better performers when we don't have stress. And that's my goal. Work performance coach. That's what I do. And so my goal is to help us all perform better in our work. And that stress is a challenge to that performance, that we don't perform well when we're under these high levels of stress, particularly continuously. So that's why I'm dealing with this. Now, in the book, The Myth of Stress, stress is defined as a difference between our expectation of events or situations, if you will, and what we actually experience when we participate in those events or situations. Okay, that's a little bit of a mouthful, so let's think about it. And I've used this analogy before. We have stress around, say, traffic. Traffic makes us angry, it frustrates us, it causes us to mentally behave in odd ways. That frustration, that sense of defeatedness that we get from the traffic situation wherever you live. Like you're wasting time and like nobody else has to deal with these kinds of ideas. And that's pretty much where the stress is at here. Again, based on my understanding of this book. Now, the book goes into some detail, and I highly recommend that you take a look at the book. The book goes into great detail about a process to deal with this. And I hesitate to summarize because I'm afraid you're going to stop with my summary, which is not good enough for you to act on. But I do have to kind of tell you what he's doing in order that you get some motivation to go pick up the book. And the way he prescribes to deal with stress is to learn new expectations. Our expectations are given to us, are served up in some ways by our brain. And based on those expectations are based on our history, a lot of stories that we understand, a lot of experiences that we've had. And so we've got to get in there and get those expectations changed. And that's the whole process. And he talks about what that looks like on a case by case basis. The book has exercises and little workshops. And so you can follow along and you can actually do things. And it's just a great, great book. Now, when I talk to people, I want to talk about the stress related to our attention and our tasks. And as I'm talking to people about this, I often get the sense that people are deflecting the problem to some degree. And they might think, well, this is just an unusually hectic or busy time in my life. And I remember a past when I wasn't this busy, or I didn't feel this busy, or this stressed, or this frantic. And I have an expectation of a future time when my situation will calm down somewhat. There will be fewer demands on my time and attention and this kind of thinking. And one of the reasons that we're going to talk about this set of events here later in the podcast is I'm going to convince you that it's not just your local environment that these factors are increasing. It's globally to some degree. It's definitely a Western United States phenomenon, Western world, right? Developed world phenomenon. And particularly, I think in the United States, of course, in the United States is the only culture that I participate in. So it's the only one I truly understand. Um, when we get our expectations out of line with reality is when we experience stress. And so the expectation that this situation is going to resolve itself, then when we get there, it doesn't resolve itself. So that's why we get back into stress around this. And again, my primary concern about stress is that it's not cleanly distinguished from frustration about our inability to do things. So that's out there, but don't let it dissuade you from taking advantage of this resource there in the book. Some people believe not so much that their situation will change. In other words, they'll get less busy in their job, or their company will hire them some help or something along those lines. Instead of that, I think other people believe, or maybe both are true, that as a culture, as a society, will somehow, either through technology or through adaptation, will get better at dealing with demands on our attention, demands on the amount of information we expect to consume, these sorts of things. And I also think that that's a poor assumption. There's no indication that the forces that we'll talk about are peaking, i.e., that they've hit a high and they're now trending in a non-increasing direction. So for that reason, I would suggest to us, if we're not doing something about this stress, then we're losing ground. If we're not doing something to get better, personally get better, then we're losing ground. And if we're counting on our tools or our work culture or something else to come to our rescue, that's just another false expectation. I study this stuff and I certainly don't see any technological change in the near term. I don't see any cultural or work culture change in the near term that's going to act to resolve this challenge, to resolve these forces, and thus change what we feel in our culture and in our work world. So we've got stress, and now we understand stress a little bit more. And we've got some general notion of what we want to do about it. And the general notion of what we want to do about it is to get our expectations in line with reality. Now, sometimes that's bad news. Sometimes we would accuse people that do this of pessimism. And as I've posted before, I'm no fan of pessimism. I'm very much an optimistic kind of person, but that optimism is based in I'll be able to deal with it and handle it and create a solution as compared to maybe some sense that I'm incapable of doing that. And that's the basis of that optimism. Not that the world is going to get better, but that I'm capable of taking the steps and learning to do better myself. So that's this deal about how do we deal with stress. Another way, and when we think about dealing with our expectations, is where the notion of contentment comes in. So that's the second piece that I've been talking about here is this notion of contentment. And I don't think I need to go define contentment for you. I think we all know a definition of contentment that's close enough to be realistic. And what we are challenged with is it the right thing to do? In other words, should I try to increase my level of contentment or should I not? I think that's a very important question, particularly in our culture and in our society. And my answer is yes, we should. We should have some sense. I don't think we should stagnate, but I do think we should have some sense of contentment, some sense of comfort in what we individually have done. I think that sense of contentment comes from looking back and going, well, I'm not where I want to be, but I sure am a great deal further than I used to be, and be able to measure that as we go forward. That's a podcast that I'm pretty sure I've done before, is in the archive somewhere, talking about the gap and the gain. We've all made great gains as we've worked on our careers. And if we look at that, then it's not contentment sitting on my laurels contentment. It's more, it's deeper than that. It's contentment with my abilities to deal with situations and my contentment with my own adulthood and my own ability to make choices. And we'll talk about what that is a little bit after I give an example of where contentment is being eroded in the culture. I think expectations are escalating. I'll give an example of this escalating expectation, which should clarify a challenging concept. So I'm aware through news reports, it doesn't matter, of a 8th grade graduation celebration. And the celebration is in the form of a dinner dance event for the youngsters who are graduating. And it struck me that this is an example of a phenomenon in our culture that is part of this discontentment. And it's an interesting subject to be discontent about. But anyway, when we do these things for children, we see them getting more elaborate, we see them getting more expensive. And the people that were telling me about this story were basically asking the question about, okay, well, how do we handle this with the cultural expectations? For example, their little boy wanted to get a girl to go to this celebration with him. They were pairing up and having, dare I say it, dates. And then there was this question about, okay, well, who's going to pay for what? And the tickets for this thing are $30 a seat. And oh, by the way, it's listed as being a semi-formal occasion. So do we have to go buy clothes for this? And the parents of a young man were talking, but they were talking about the parents of young women. And I just can't imagine what would happen if your daughter was invited to an occasion that was considered semi-formal. I mean, are we talking about going out and buying an outfit, and what does semi-formal mean these days, and all these challenges? And I look back in my history and I remember a recognition of the fact that I was leaving middle school and entering high school, middle school or junior high, and entering high school. And I remember that there was some discussion of that. It seems like there was something in the auditorium. It wasn't a big deal. It certainly wasn't a after hours event. Certainly there were no tickets sold. I think some parents were able to come if they wanted to and take snapshots, whatever that looked like. But what I see in the culture is that these events are gaining increasing ability for us to demonstrate our status in the world. It's been fairly recently, I'll give you another example that's in similar vein. Give you another example that has come in my awareness just in the last couple of decades. And it's this notion, this term is a promposal. So a proposal that we go to the prom. Now, I went to the prom when I was a kid. It's a long time ago now. But a promposal then is this notion that the asking of someone to the prom is an event itself that needs to be choreographed and spectacular and sensational, presumably in hopes that the invitee will be so impressed that they'll say yes. And big deals here. Gender reveal parties. And I don't want to skew anybody's sacred cow. I'm a fan of having fun, but all these elaborate things that are happening, and they're getting more and more elaborate. And what that does in a series of events, escalating one early in the series sort of forces the escalation of another one later in the series. For example, if you have your promposal at the local stadium on the big board with you and your date on camera, that's great. That's a promposal, and I think it would get on Facebook and get some views. But what then does one do when one actually proposes marriage? How do you show the excitement, the differential excitement? And so that's this escalation that I'm talking about. And so promposal is there, eighth graders, girls on dates, semi-formal occasion, 14-year-olds, nobody here can drive. So it's a challenge for the adults to support this. And that's just one example of a thing that I'm seeing in the culture that is, the only term I can come up with is parenting inflation. And the fact that these events are now so public that they somehow interact with our reputation as human beings and as parents of these children. And oh, what do you mean, you didn't invest in your child attending this eighth grade ceremony and the culture? All of this is happening in the world. Not terribly long ago, a cruise on a ship was considered to be a very grown up, very sophisticated, very romantic type vacation. And as such, the cultural thought around that was it was a husband and wife that would take an anniversary trip and go on a cruise together, and that they would be able to spend time together in this fine environment. And it was very, very grown up and very, very elevated. And what I see as much as anything now is that cruises are morphing to be oriented towards families and involving increasingly younger children. And that this then is a thing that the adults in the situation accept and understand. And I don't know that there's anything wrong with it per se, but 40 years ago, nobody was taking their young children on a cruise with them. That was kind of the opposite of the intent. If anything, the intent was, dare I say it, to park the kids with grandma for a week or two and be a couple together and these kinds of ideas. And so that's just another example of this inflationary thing. And I can't come up with a better term than that the culture imposes on us. I love my kids. I want my kids to have a nice childhood. I get it. But my job is to be their parent first and foremost. I don't want to skewer anybody's sacred cow here. So just an example of a series that I see happening, of an escalation that I see happening that causes stress and causes our contentment to be challenged. Another sort of example or signal, if you will, there used to be a word that we would use, and the word is ostentatious. And I say it that way because I haven't heard it in a long time. And I just want to be clear about the word that I'm using, ostentatious. Ostentatious referred to some display of wealth, status that was considered to be gauche, not very classy, showing off. So one would say an ostentatious display of wealth. And it was a real negative term. And the idea is that these displays of wealth make neighbors and fellow citizens feel bad about themselves. And so we would just be, very calm and very relaxed about our wealth, and we would use it in ways that made sense, but that we would refrain from showiness and these ideas. And as near as I can tell, that word has evaporated from the culture. And in fact, if anything, it seems to be the opposite now. That people who have wealth tend to really, for lack of a better term, go out of their way to show that they do. And this is a cultural expectation. At least the culture accepts it. And then the comparison pulls us all along. So in this sense, this notion of contentment is very much countercultural. And contentment can also be applied to our work life. Am I content with my situation? And it doesn't mean that I want to sit still, but one could be content with one's rate of progress. And I think that's great. And so when we look at this stress and noting that the increase in stress is a cultural phenomenon in some ways, that then this contentment is countercultural. And it's a social thing that we take on when we try to behave in this countercultural way. We don't want to be seen as incapable of living up to this cultural norm, this increasing cultural norm, of which I've given a couple of examples. The culture in this way has associated contentment with inability. Certainly, the things are not synonyms, but what we fear from the culture is rejection based on this inability that the culture presumes we have around contentment. So previously we were using the word ostentatious. There weren't a lot of what we called ostentatious displays of wealth. It didn't mean nobody was wealthy. It just meant they didn't show off enough. But since then, what has happened is the culture has changed such that this idea of contentment is very tightly associated with inability to achieve the result, or inability to pay for the situation, the eighth grade event with dates and things. Our unwillingness to participate is countercultural, and thus the culture frowns. So contentment is a thing that used to be supported by the culture. And this is my point. And now contentment is not supported by the culture. And we need to be aware of that. I think contentment is still a good thing. But I think that the culture has pushed us away from it. And in particular, the aspect of the culture that is pushing us away from it is the consumerist culture, and the fact that we're constantly marketed to the Western culture treats us individuals as almost purely consumers. And most of the information that we're exposed to is associated with an attempt to get us to behave in consumer-like fashion and to acquire stuff. And the culture is just moving in this direction. And cultures do that. It happens. They drift. I don't know that it's intentional on anybody's part to move the culture in this direction. I think it's just a combined set of actions that people are taking, looking out for their self-interest. So that's the notion of contentment. And you can see how bringing some contentment into our lives would counter some of the stresses that are available to us, that are imposed on us externally. Now, one of the big deals right now, and one of the challenges to our contentment, is our ability to deal with information and our ability to perform effectively in an information economy. So that's a real challenge, because there's this growing trend in society that forces us to greater heights in order for a degree of success to be achieved, forces us to greater heights of dealing with information. And when we think about information on this podcast, we think about information, we always think about attention, because information and attention go hand in hand. If information is the product, attention is how that product gets consumed and utilized by each of us. So when we think about factors around attention, the demand on our attention is increasing. And the reason I say that is, one, we're all trying to get each other's attention. Our attention has proven to be valuable, if in no other sense than the sense of being consumers. When we pay attention to things, we start behaving in certain ways. And depending on what we're paying attention to, there are predictable influences on our behavior. And the claims on our attention, the amount of effort that's going forth to acquire our attention is increasing. The technology available to keep our attention once it has been required is improving. And this is a technological / cultural force that has been increasing over my lifetime. And I don't think that's a surprise to anybody. As I'm fond of saying, 40 years ago, there were about 3 ways to get my attention. There was my landline telephone, there was knocking on my door, and there was sending me a letter in the mail. And that was it. And now there's this plethora of ways for us to try to get each other's attention. And it's happening increasingly as it's driven by profits in the business world and, again, the consumerist culture. So the demand on our attention is increasing all the time. The demand is driven by the technology that enables people who want our attention to continually have better and better ways to get it, more and more effective ways to get it. Okay, so that's one thing that's moving in an upward direction. The second thing that's moving in an upward direction is our core level, our core need for information and the amount of communication that we engage in, both are increasing. What I mean by that is in all of our social relationships, and by social, I mean work, I mean with other people, social, church, all these things. We seem to have enacted a belief that more information is better. And more people are trying to say more things about what's going on in them. This is true at work. It's true in our social engagements. It used to be that a social group, for example, would have a get together weekly, say, or monthly, and they'd have a newsletter that came out at some regular basis. And that was really about all the attention that it tried to claim. Well, now our social groups want to chatter to us. They want to communicate with us more because we have bought the idea that more information and thus more communication is better. And that certainly has been shown to be untrue, at least with core ideas of information. I think communication is important. I don't know that sheerly more is any better. I know that higher quality is better, but there's a big difference between more words and higher quality communication. So all this is happening in the workplace is a great example. We're moving from a culture in the workplace of individual contributors to a culture of teams. We're moving from a culture of satisfaction to a culture of engagement. And the expectation is that there will be more investment in the association between the worker and the work. and that teams will communicate a lot more than individuals were thought to need to communicate. So that's the second one. Communication is the exchange of information. So if we're going to communicate more, there's got to be more information out there. More emails than there ever were memos or phone calls. We get into chat apps in our work where it's a nonstop set of commentary and discussion that we are challenged to ignore. So that's two. The levels of information, if you will, are increasing. The third component or fact here is that for the first time in human history, the majority of us are using our attention as our productive asset. It used to be we used our hands and our muscles as our productive asset with a little bit of attention and knowledge involved. And now the ratio of that has flipped pretty dramatically. So we're engaged in knowledge work, we're engaged in creative work, we're engaged in problem solving work, and all these things are sort of attention intensive as compared to some rote physical labor that was not as attention intensive. So the work culture is moving in this direction. The point is that our attention is now becoming our productive resource. And that's the third fact. Now, I will say there's a subset of one of the factors, or maybe it's a fourth factor. I think it's either a subset of three or a subset of one, but it doesn't matter. So fact 3.5, if you will. I said there would be three. This is fact 3.5. And it's just to notice something. And what I want us to notice is that we in the West, and particularly in America, I believe, are the most entertained society in history. Now, yay, we're all entertained. Okay, yes, I understand. But if we define entertainment well, then we're going to see how this contributes to the rest of this overall situation. If we define entertainment as a pleasant deployment of our attention, which I think is a legitimate description, a legitimate definition of entertainment, because we go to the movies and we don't do much. We sit there and our attention is pleasantly captivated by what's going on the screen. So that's just one example of many. And that really, at the end of the day, is what entertainment is. Some of it's more physical and more oriented towards creating feelings of excitement or adrenaline in us, roller coasters and the like. Other entertainments are more calm, concerts and the like, listening to music. All of these things, first and foremost, engage our attention. And sports first and foremost engage us physically. So we're the most entertained society in history, which means that we devote an increasingly large portion of our attention to our entertainment, more than we ever have. We're watching more television and we're consuming more screens, and the only mechanism to do this is to utilize our attention. Now, my idea is that we wandered into this situation, that it's not, again, none of these 3.5 things are caused. But what happens is they all collide over our attention. The fact that we're the most entertained society in history means that we spend a lot of attention on being entertained. At the same time, our attention has become our productive resource. So we're feeling this constraint. And that's this attention problem, and it produces this stress for us because we feel that overstretched idea around our attention. And that's what gives us this notion of stress. We feel like we can't keep up. Fear of missing out is a new term. And I guess at some level, humans have had this fear forever, but it seems to be increasingly true or increasingly intense, a better way to say it. So the point of all that is that these factors, the amounts of information are increasing exponentially. Communication is increasing as a cultural phenomenon. I don't see it peaking and going back down anytime soon. All of this, say all these different ways, the demands on our attention are increasing. These forces together are all unified around needing our attention or demanding our attention. At the very same time that we're now in a position where we have to use our attention in order to make our living. And that's where the conflict comes in. If we had a job that didn't rely on our attention at all, then we would feel less worn out at the end of the day and more apt to spend our attention on entertainments, for example. But our attention is deployed in a high level of intensity for the entire time that we're away. And that's a challenge to us and causes stress. Now, I brought contentment in there because, again, contentment is satisfaction with a level of engagement or involvement. And so perhaps contentment with our social world as it stands, or contentment with our technological services as they stand, would be a good way to attack this problem. And I told you at the outset, my promise is if you manage your attention well, then this stress will go away. And I've certainly demonstrated over and over again some ideas about how to do that. And I just wanted to get a bigger picture of the situation into your hands. So it's not something, it's not a failing necessarily on your individual part to not be able to keep up. And it's certainly not a short-term trend that's going to resolve itself next quarter or next year, that things are going to calm down. There's no reason to think that any of this is going to plateau or decrease anytime soon. So all of that, I hope it winds up being encouragement to do something. When I say we wandered into this situation, what I mean is we didn't ask for it and we didn't predict it terribly well in the sense of taking action about it. So we're not prepared. We don't have good tactics for dealing with it. And it being the stress related to attention and lack of contentment. And so I'm arguing that we should spend time and invest in learning good tactics for dealing with this stuff so that we can manage our situation better. This is not really perhaps as fragmented as one might expect. And I hope that you see that unification across these ideas. And we'll do a quick review just to help make that happen. So stress is a difference between our expectation of a situation and that situation in reality. A good case of stress for our talk today is, well, I'm really busy, but I'll expect that that shouldn't be the case. And then, particularly in the future, I'll be less busy than I am now. So that would be an expectation mismatch that then, according to the book, The Myth of Stress, causes stress and this feeling of frustration for us. The second part of what we talked about is this idea of contentment. And I think contentment gets a bad rap as being, we'll just sit still. I don't think that's it. I think we can be content with an existing growth rate and not feel like that we constantly have to be compounding and increasing our increase. And so some ways to think about contentment and some ways to think about the fact that our society does not support contentment anywhere near the degree that perhaps it once did. And so some way to think about that. And then in the third case, when we look at that, one of the things that's happening to us in the world is the demands on our attention are increasing because of societal forces. And so this is not something that is just isolated cases or individuals who struggle to keep up or whatever it is. This is a real thing. And so in some way, I want you to understand this so you set your expectations correctly. And thus that reduces your stress, according to Andrew Bernstein, but also so that we can all see that there's an increased need for good tactics around this. And I think that the tactics are available for us to be better at it and thus be able to match what we're capable of with what the world requires, match that a little more closely as we get better and better at dealing with our attention in an information-rich world. So I hope this has been helpful to you. Again, I hope it's been encouraging. Let's get this thing out and let's take a look at it and let's figure out how to deal with it so that we're on top of our game the best we can be. And then that will help us to deal with the level of stress that apparently needs some more awareness about it because April is Stress Awareness Month. So think about those things. If you'd like to chat about it, I'm happy to have a conversation. I'm a consultant. The first hour is free. So if you want to get a hold of me and have a coaching conversation for an hour, I'd love to do that. If you want to tell me something about the podcast or you have a question, love to hear from you about that as well. Okay. And feel free to reach out to me. I'm not hard to find. You can find me on LinkedIn if you'd like, if you're there and active on LinkedIn. Larry Tribble, you can just search that and I'm not hard to find. Also, if you'd like to communicate directly, more directly, then you can reach me at larry@dobusywright.com. And then stay tuned for the podcast. If you get a minute, love for you to rate the podcast on your service. That's always helpful. All the podcasters say it, and it won't take but a minute. So feel free to get out there and give us a review. And would love to, as I said, hear from you individually about some things that you feel are going on in your world. So with that said, I wish you contentment, low stress, and that's what we mean when we say do busy right. So I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusywright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do busy right.